welcome to Baruch College and to the School of Public Affairs. My name is David Birdsell. I am the Dean of the School of Public Affairs, and I am thrilled to welcome you this evening to this very important discussion about an issue that has enjoyed a great deal of prominence in the news, and that speaks so resonantly to the themes of the lecture series of which this evening's program is a part. I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. But as we look at the Park 51 controversy, and I'm going to try to name it by all of its names before I finish this brief introduction, we see something that at one level may not have appeared on its face to be a public policy problem, but that in so many ways brings together the strands of language, brings together the strands of demography, brings together the strands of secular governance with religious institutions, brings together the relatively mundane considerations, pace, Professor Goring, of zoning and other kinds of considerations related to building, and does so in an environment whipped to a level of volatility by media that is in many respects unprecedented, but certainly will not be so as we move through a 24/7 media environment, as well as all of the knotty policy questions that we will discuss here. I mentioned these themes very, very briefly because I want to use them to focus what the Lillian Nathan Ackerman lectures in equality and social justice have done over the course of their many seasons. They focus on questions about representation. They look at questions of rights. They bring to the campus extraordinary speakers who address these issues from their lived experience and from their scholarly practices. They are people who can help us understand what goes on in a way that is intellectually satisfying and in ways that enrich the capacity for citizenship of every person in this room and everybody who is privileged to see, whether live or on videotape, the kinds of programs that this lecture series has made possible. And it has been made possible through the generosity of Erwin and Rosalind Engelman, whom I would like to thank very much. They are in the front row this evening, and I hope you have a chance to meet them. And now I would like to welcome Marian Engelman-Latto. Marian I first met when she was our colleague here at the School of Public Affairs in the 1990s. She has an extraordinary breadth of scholarly attention to issues of social justice and also to the intersections of law and politics. When she left the School of Public Affairs, she spent a decade, the past decade roughly, at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest as their general counsel, and made groundbreaking law in many of the areas that we'll talk about tonight, and certain areas that continue to propel her career. After a 2-year visiting stint at the law school at Seton Hall University, she joined Earth Justice, where she now directs national environmental programs. Marian Engelman-Latto.
Thank you so much to the always eloquent Dean Birdsell. My grandparents, for whom this lecture is named, came to this country under differing circumstances. My grandfather was actually traveling when stranded here when World War I broke out. But my grandmother, Lily Ackerman, came to the United States to flee religious persecution. And to her, the United States was a safe haven, a place that would not tolerate religious persecution. Yet, the United States has not always welcomed all comers, nor treated people from all lands or all backgrounds equally. And today, since 9/11, we've seen the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment, an intolerance that has the same seeds as the anti-Semitism that led my grandmother to literally hide among potatoes years ago in the shtetl, in her hometown, in fear of the violence of pogroms. Those seeds, treating people of different backgrounds as the other, scapegoating, generalizing. Just last week, voters in Oklahoma passed a proposition, State Question 755, prohibiting state judges from, quote, considering Sharia law. It's disconcerting that a proposition like this made it onto the ballot. How can a proposition prohibiting consideration of Sharia law, but not the Talmud and not the King James Bible, be squared with the Establishment Clause of the Constitution? But even more troubling is that it passed. Of the approximately 1 million people who cast a vote on the issue last week, 695,568, or 70%, voted to amend the Oklahoma Constitution to prohibit courts from considering Sharia law. As an aside, yesterday a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order blocking state certification of the ballot measure, so it's on hold. In any case, it is within this context and the context of a lecture series that is dedicated to addressing issues of inequality and justice in the United States that we have our discussion this evening about the opposition to the location of a Muslim community center. The lecture series is in my grandparents' honor, and it grows out of the experience of oppression and an aspiration that the United States can truly be a haven for all people of all backgrounds with protection against discrimination for all. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to embarrass our moderator. In addition to supporting this lecture series, the Ackerman program carries with it a visiting chair in social justice, and that chair has been occupied for 3 years by Ken Marcus, the gentleman to my left, and I must say that Professor Marcus has broken the mold in many ways. You see extraordinary breadth. You see that tied to experience. We're talking about a man who was staff director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Enforcement in the Department of Education, operating enforcement of civil rights issues in that department. This is for someone who lives that experience, who ties it to impeccable scholarship. I cannot think of anybody who is a better representation of the values, of the diligence, and of the energy that was envisioned when the Engelmans made this gift and established this chair. And I give you, with that tonight, our moderator, Professor Ken Marcus.
There are so many questions that come to play when we talk about the Ground Zero controversy that I'm almost reluctant to begin to frame them, because I know that there are so many different perspectives on it. And my goal today is not to present to you a way of looking at this project, or even to say that this Ground Zero controversy is about honoring the memory of a certain group of people as opposed to something else. We have to talk about the question of discrimination against Muslims, whether we call it Islamophobia or not. But we have to understand that there are many ways of looking at it. We have to talk about what 9/11 means and should mean, and the fact that there are lots of different ways of defining it. We have to ask about whether our perspective depends in some way on who we are and who we come from, whether that's our religious background, whether that's social class, whether that's political and ideological perspective. The issues that we deal with in this series and in this program are issues about which many of us have very strongly felt positions, and we feel very passionately about them. But we feel passionately about convictions that are not shared necessarily by others who also approach these issues with great sincerity and with great passion. Tonight, I hope, will be a dialogue which will give us a window into how such issues can be considered with reason, with intelligence, certainly with emotion, but also with respect and with civility. And to remember that while we may have, either at the beginning or at the end of this discussion, strong convictions, other people have other ways of looking at it as well. This is not a debate tonight, although debates have their place, so much as this is a dialogue that I hope will give us an opportunity to flesh out some of the issues from multiple perspectives. We have a truly distinguished panel. They may be affiliated with different religious institutions or secular institutions or political commitments, but they are here as themselves. And they are here as people who have thought seriously about the questions arising from the Ground Zero Mosque or Ground Zero Center. The Reverend Chloe Breyer, we know, is executive director of the Interfaith Center of New York, and she has written about this very controversy thoughtfully about questions of interfaith engagement and the question of should groups be taking sides, or how do we look at it. Rabbi David Ellenson is the president of a great theological institution, a training ground for many of our nation's rabbis, and he too has written about this question and provided a perspective from his background on it. Ryan Mahoney is a board member of the Council of American Islamic Relations and also of the Upper Westchester Muslim Society's board of directors. And he comes with a connection to organizations that have a concern for issues of civil rights, including civil rights of Muslims. Jonathan Tobin, the executive director of Commentary Magazine, has also written about this issue and about the dialogue or discourse surrounding the issue and what that says about us. Let me first broach with you, if I may, the difficult and emotionally wrought question of how we should remember 9/11 and what it should mean to us as Americans today and in the future, whether in connection with this particular controversy or in any of the other public matters to which it might be related. And I'm going to begin by asking, if I may, Ryan and then David, if you would address the assertion that a proper regard for the families of 9/11 victims suggests that we behave in a certain way. Now, I'll begin by saying that with respect to the 9/11 Center, there are those who say that a proper regard for the families of 9/11 victims means either it should or shouldn't be built, either that it's inappropriate or that criticizing it is inappropriate, and others who say no, it's neither inappropriate to criticize nor inappropriate to build, because in fact it's an entirely different thing. Whether we're talking about the center or whether we're not talking about the center, how should we think about the memory of that situation and what it means to respect that? Ryan.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Ryan Mahoney from the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I don't know, I think it's a very complicated question, and it has to be dealt with in different ways. Certainly, probably everyone here in this room either had lost someone or knows someone who has lost someone or was affected by it in some way. And I think that personal grief is a personal matter, but that grief should not be used as a mechanism to deprive anyone of their rights. For example, it saddens me that there are people who find it offensive that some human beings who happen to be Muslim would embrace capitalism and look to purchase a building, to use it as a community center, to have community programming, to benefit the community. So there's some people out there say, oh man, these Muslims are trying to build a community center. That offends me. I mean, certainly Muslims should be included as the victims of 9/11, because many Muslims died in the event that took place. Many Muslims lost their life as first responders. There was a prayer space, within the Twin Towers. So Muslims shouldn't be seen as the offenders here, but they should be included as the victims, as Americans, as people such as myself who experience a loss, and people should look to work together to heal each other rather than to try to divide the community, and especially if it means depriving someone's basic right to purchase a property and use it for what they deem fit, as long as it's in accordance with the laws of this great country. Thank you.
One is the question of wherever a great tragedy has occurred, whether it be Pearl Harbor, Auschwitz, the Twin Towers on 9/11, the question is, how does one, in fact, appropriately construct a memorial in order to derive lessons from what this event was? I think this is a general question, and in a very real way, when we talk about 9/11, the issue of whether a Muslim cultural center or a mosque could be constructed close to ground zero. And I will assert, and perhaps Ken will quote from this later, I've been a very, very strong advocate of that construction. But I would separate the question that you've asked from the immediate issue of the construction of the mosque and the cultural center near ground zero. It seems to me that the question that you pose is one that could be posed about any number of events. Quite clearly, whether we're creating a Holocaust memorial, a memorial for people who were victimized on 9/11 by these terrorists and by their heinous activities. The largest lesson that we should learn is what are the values that come to be expressed. Hopefully, part of what one would learn from a memorial is that, to quote the motto of Colonial Williamsburg, which comes to mind right now, that the present might in fact learn from the past. In other words, it seems to me that the real point of any kind of memorial that would be constructed, and that seems to me to be a completely separate question from the specificity of the issue that we're discussing tonight surrounding ground zero, should really ask the question, how is it then that values that all of us would in fact desire to champion, how is it these things can be learned? How is it that members of different groups that constitute the rainbow that marks the United States of America, how is it that we could learn lessons from this so that ultimately values of empathy for those who are oppressed and for those who in fact are also the victims of these kinds of events, how is it that these things could be realized? It seems to me that ultimately what it is that we should attempt to derive from this, and the most lasting monument, in my opinion, is not really whatever building or monument or memorial would come to be constructed, but rather I think the real question is what are the values for which the United States of America stands? What really are the values that we embody? You mentioned some of them really right at the very beginning tonight, Miriam, and it seems to me that in talking about the specificity of this issue as well as the more general issue, that there are values of freedom, equality, democracy that
And we will address that very specific question.
That the United States represents, and the most fitting memorial then I would say that we could construct would be to champion these kinds of values as we move ahead.
I think it might be useful to frame the next part of this by taking a quotation from a 2007 op-ed, so it is certainly before, and it's from a prominent American political commentator. My students can think if they can figure out who it was. But here's what he said 3 years ago. And I'm going to ask first Chloe and then Jonathan to address this. He said, some believe that it is time to start ratcheting down the hype about 9/11 and placing it in its proper historical perspective as a national tragedy, but not one that should dominate our thinking or the way we live our lives. Chloe, do you think that this is an issue? To what extent do you think the situation of 9/11 needs to be ratcheted down? To what extent does it need to be foremost in our thinking?
To me, again, I am an Episcopal priest here in the Diocese of New York, a little church in West Harlem, and then also direct the Interfaith Center, which works with a variety of faith leaders from different backgrounds, about 15 different faith traditions, on rather practical issues. And like I think probably people in this room, worked as a volunteer chaplain following 9/11, both at the World Trade Center site and the morgue over on by the examiner's office, and was very struck by the September 12th activities, the way the city really pulled together after the 11th and contributed in every possible way, and that this is as much about the story. And so to me, actually, the most imaginative way I have heard of honoring the day, the dead, and the values that we do share is this proposal that Jay Wennick and David Payne, who put forth on a day of service, a national day of service that in some ways reminds us not just of the tragedy itself, but the way New Yorkers of all faith traditions, all economic backgrounds, really sought in the months afterwards to do what they could to rebuild the fabric of our society. So that doesn't answer your question, because I don't think you really can decide whether to ratchet up or ratchet down. I think you think of imaginative ways to respond, and that's the most imaginative one I've heard of.
Jonathan, I'm proud to say that every one of my students has figured out that you are the person who wrote that in 2007.
No. No, but I do think your quotation, you're citing that quote, whoever it was that wrote it. And I don't think it appeared in Commentary Magazine, just a wild guess. Seems to go to the heart of a lot of this discussion. You started before by asking, what does 9/11 mean? How can we interpret these meanings? And it seems to me, to most Americans, and I think rightly so, 9/11 was an unambiguous event with an unambiguous meaning. It was an attack upon the United States and upon American citizens by an Islamist group, an Islamic extremist group, acting in what they said was in the name of their religion. And as part of, in a phrase that we don't use very much anymore, a war of, a terror war against the United States. And it seems to me that so much of this discussion, a lot of this discussion has been, to use a Yiddish word, Narishkeit, the idea that whether people have right to build. I don't think any serious person opposed the right to build this center or a mosque. Certainly no one who believes in property rights. Our mayor, Bloomberg, opposed the critics of the center by citing property rights. I might note that was a little hypocritical, because anybody who's followed eminent domain issues in this city knows that whenever any rich person or individual, any rich institution wants to seize someone else's property in order to pay more taxes or to benefit some institution like my alma mater, Columbia University, Michael Bloomberg doesn't believe in property rights. Just note that parenthetically. The point here is that so much of this debate has turned into a changing of the narrative of what I said was an unambiguous event. And that instead of discussing how to honor the dead, how to deal with the situation that this attack left the United States in, and we can certainly debate various measures that ensued, it turned it into that instead of the United States being the object of the attack, that the United States is somehow the oppressor. What I think is a false narrative of oppression of Muslims in this country, which seems to me completely contrary to the facts as we've lived them in this last decade. And that changing this narrative, putting forward, I think, an entirely false view of the United States, seems to be the whole point of much of this debate, and indeed the way some of my colleagues here have framed it. This is not a matter of question of tolerance, for whom America is a tolerant country. It has been a tolerant country, and even in the last 10 years, it has clearly reaffirmed those values of tolerance, as our Muslim neighbors have been, with a few exceptions, although I might add there have been still more anti-Semitic attacks in this country in the last 10 years than anti-Muslim attacks. This is still a country that stands up for those ideas. And if we are changing the narrative about 9/11 in order to say that, well, it's no longer a question of remembering the victims, it's a question of that we have to build something there in order to honor the new victims, that the real story is about the victimization of Muslims in this country. I would say that many, if not most Americans, reject that narrative and resent it bitterly. And whether they think it's appropriate or not appropriate, whether some foolishly would claim that people don't have the right to build on their own property, is a position that I would never embrace. That the real debate here is about this false narrative, this mythical post 9/11 backlash that did not occur, is not occurring, and that has changed the whole way we view this issue, and I think wrongly so, and distorted the debate about this center and turned it into one that is no longer about what is appropriate or not appropriate, whether it's right to listen to the victims and say that this is not something that we should do, and turned it into one where those who have, virtually anyone who has voiced dissent about this, who has raised even the most reasoned and nuanced arguments about this issue, has been branded a bigot. And that's wrong, and this narrative that backs it up is wrong.
Jonathan used a word tonight called Islamist. Anyone here, has anyone ever met an Islamist before? No. And you know what? You're not ever going to meet an Islamist, because I'm going to use a terrible word, and I personally think that Islamist is a terrible word, but I'm going to use another terrible word, and I want you to forgive me for it in advance. I'm going to say the word nigger. You will never meet a nigger. There's not a person in the world who has a use for a word like this, because it's just a word that was used by another group to imply something about someone else, that they're inferior or some nonsense.
To assert,
sir.
excuse me,
Sir.
you are calling,
Well,
you are
excuse
saying
me,
that I
we-
have done
we
the
need to
equivalent
have-
of
we
calling,
need
of
to
using
have
that
some order
N-word.
here.
I'm sorry,
When-
let's go one at a
Point
time.
of order.
I'm sorry.
You
I
are
listened
asserting
to all
something
the
that is
nonsense
simply
If I may,
false.
if I may, okay. Again, demonstrating very well that people who care very strongly about these issues have not only different positions, but entirely different way of framing them and thinking about them. David, you began in your last question to address the question that I think requires a little bit more elaboration, and that is the question of whether there are core American values that are implicated in what's going on. And I think we can expect, from what we've already heard, that there will be different conceptions of what those values might be. But from your perspective, what are the American values that are either consistent or inconsistent with what we have been seeing in connection with the Ground Zero proposal? And then I'm going to ask the same question first of you and then of Chloe, if I may.
Okay. I think in light of the last exchange, I'm not sure that I can answer the question without some reference to what was
Be quiet.
to what
Excuse me,
was
but you weren't talking about me.
to what was stated before. I do think that
Be quiet.
Jonathan, in his comments, points to something significant. I do think that we live in an age where we need to recognize that war and conflict are not waged completely in classical categories by nation states. Namely, part of what 9/11 reveals is that there are groups of individuals who are not part of nation states that in fact are quite capable of wreaking tremendous harm on highly significant populations. It means the whole way in which we think about issues of war and peace, I think, and how it is that one in fact engages in legitimate defense of one's own people has to be reconsidered. Certainly from the viewpoint of Jewish religious tradition, there is a statement in the Talmud, Haba lahorgacha hashkem lahorgo. If someone comes to attack you, you certainly have a right to rise up and defend yourself against that individual. I suspect that many religious traditions have this kind of ethic that is embodied in their core teachings. Having made that comment, I would like to say in response to your question and in light of what Jonathan pointed to, that from my own perspective, the question here is not really a meta-narrative or a global narrative that's being given. Rather, in some ways, I would rather deal with the issue in terms of all of its specificity. The reality is that there are tremendous distinctions that have to be made between, on the one hand, what I might call social prejudice and what political scientists routinely define as institutional or political forms of discrimination. When you make the comment that you do, Jonathan, and I'm trying to respond to your question also about values, quite clearly there are forms of social discrimination that exist everywhere in our society that are projected against virtually every kind of group. Part of what we need to be concerned about is when is it that the government begins to get involved, and so when is it you have institutionalized forms of racism. I grew up in Virginia in the 1950s at a time of Jim Crow laws, and quite clearly the power of the government really enforced certain types of social prejudices that individuals had, in this instance, against African Americans, people of color in this country. It seems to me quite clear here that the issue of how it is that one would talk about the rights of all sorts of groups in light of the values that America holds have to be dealt with in a rather subtle way. But having said that, Jonathan, I don't think one has to really buy into this notion of a global kind of reconceptualization of the narrative of how it is America operates in looking at this particular issue. One can in fact affirm that in America we still continue to be guided by a narrative that talks about the basic notion that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and by extension I would add women, and persons of all races, colors, and religions are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That remains the master narrative that guides our country. The issue here to me is actually a much more specific issue. I don't think that anybody, or at least many people, certainly not Jonathan Tobin, are talking about the rights that individuals would have to purchase property. They are talking about the propriety of whether it's appropriate for a Islamic Cultural Center to be built several blocks away or 2 blocks away from where Ground Zero occurred. And here, I would assert, in regard to the specificity of it, I can't help but express my own opinion. I would be strong. I am, in fact, strongly in favor of this. I'm strongly in favor of it because it seems to me that, in fact, there have been, and I can't decontextualize this, that there are strong political forces in the United States that have, in fact, created this as a major kind of issue for the sole purpose of trying to exploit, in my opinion, political currents in this country and votes that would in fact support a certain type of political agenda as opposed to another. My brother lives in Virginia Beach, near where we grew up. The Virginia Beach City Council adopted a resolution against the erection of a mosque near Ground Zero. Now, why the City Council of Virginia Beach should in fact make this a major issue, I am not certain. Well, I am fairly certain. I think this comes to be an issue that in fact certain types of political forces in America can in fact exploit for all sorts of other purposes. And I don't think it really addresses the larger issue of, in this instance, the Islamic Cultural Center and Mosque being built in this area where the Imam and his group desired for it to be built and where they in fact purchased this property. I don't think the issue, and here I do agree with Jonathan, is the question of an exercise of a right, but I do think it's a question of talking about, is it in fact appropriate for this to be constructed? And while I can get into this more later, my answer would be yes, I think it's completely appropriate because it's completely consistent with the values that mark this country as a nation that affirms the rights and abilities of persons to be able to construct houses of worships and community centers in areas where the zoning, you have to be careful here, talking at Baruch College with all these MPAs, but if the zoning permits it, I see no reason why it shouldn't be done because it's completely consistent with values of freedom that our country affirms in terms of the free exercise of religion and culture.
Thank you, Chloe.
So again, I agree the rights are pretty undisputed and quite clear. The other set of what we would probably identify as American values are not written into our Constitution, but are written about by people like de Tocqueville and the person who wrote Bowling Alone, this notion that we have to, as American citizens, have responsibilities as well. And it's this part of the pretty virulent opposition, I think it's fair to say, to Park 51, or the cultural and center and mosque downtown, that is most egregious from the perspective of somebody trying to do interfaith work on the grassroots. Because we at the Interfaith Center know that there have been, a generation of many both Muslim immigrants and also African American Muslim leaders who have been doing, AIDS education in mosques in Harlem, halal soup kitchens in the Bronx, or were those first responders. In other words, creating those religious communities in our city that don't just serve their own, but contribute to the fabric, the civic fabric of our city and thus the nation. And it's that opportunity that I think is being denied with what you say is the public opposition, not to the right, but to the opportunity of a group of Muslim Americans to contribute to the wider society, not just their own, but to the elderly, to the people who want to use the swimming pool, to the community groups in Community Board 1 who don't have enough space to sit down and do what they need to do. That very boring sort of civic opportunity and association that is what we all value, and now has a particular opportunity to be expressed in Muslim terms. And that is what everyone said after 9/11, what we wanted. Where are the moderate Muslim voices? We asked, and then we have a few of them that are rising to the fore and creating a platform to themselves, but we don't want that. And I just think it's a little bit, it reminds me of, I don't know if any of you have been on jury duty and have seen that wonderful video that Judge Judith Kaye did of reminding us of the origins of our judicial system with the way that witches used to be tried, that they were either going to be drowned and show their innocence or not and burned at the stake. And I'm afraid we have slightly put the leadership of Park 51 in that position by saying that we wish for moderate Muslims, but those folks who have demonstrated over a lifetime that sort of proclivity and now are trying to exert this, expression of contributing to public life are now being denied the opportunity.
Thank you. Let me ask a question now. I think it's clear, Ryan and Jonathan, that there is significant disagreement about the level of anti-Muslim discrimination in the United States and the extent to which anti-Muslim discrimination has played a material role in the dispute about Ground Zero. Do you believe that it is a symptom of a much deeper and profound Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bigotry throughout the United States? Or do you think that it is an anomaly in a country that otherwise stands for very different principles?
When you're Muslim and you participate in the media, you're put in this weird situation where again and again and again you're asked to condemn acts of terrorism that you didn't commit and that you don't condone. And when you're done telling everybody what you don't stand for, like honor killings, have nothing whatsoever to do with Islam, but we have to go on the media every once in a while and say that, and then as soon as we're finished doing that, time's up, right? It's a very frustrating situation. Recently on Fox News, an excellent bastion of journalism, Brian Kilmeade made this statement. He said, "Sure, I know that, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim," right? And this kind of a statement just floats through the air, right? And goes unquestioned, except for people like me who go to the FBI's website and say, what does the FBI have to say about this? Are all terrorists really Muslim? So they have a public report. Anyone can download it. It's there. It's very clear, right? And they have documented 287 accounts of terrorism that the FBI says, these are the terrorist cases. Now, when we go through the list, we'll find that it's true. Some Muslims have committed acts of terrorism. 16 of the 287 have been committed by Muslims. That's roughly 6%. Brian Kilmeade's statement, it's like mathematical illiteracy to think that 94% of terrorism in this country is perpetrated by all kinds of different groups. They might be, could be Latino, they could be Jewish, they could be any sort of group, right? But Muslims are somehow responsible for all of it. This is the situation that we're dealing with, and I think there's no doubt about it that whether you want to call it Islamophobia or whatever, that this is a central issue here. Park 51 is the most famous community center that's never been built. It's so boring, but the fact that Muslims are trying to do something for their community is controversial. It's really ridiculous.
It's pretty clear to me, and I think to most people who have even had any passing thoughts about this issue, is that the only reason why the Park 51 project is controversial was because of the decision to locate it where it was attempted to be located. There are controversies in every city and town and village in this country about the placement of houses of worship. Whether they're synagogues or churches, nobody ever wants a house of worship, especially in the suburbs, because they think it's going to affect traffic and property values. These controversies are they're myriad examples. In fact, there's a whole section of case law about it now. The controversy was about the location. And the reason why the city council of Virginia Beach or any other group are weighing in on it was because most Americans feel a very strong connection to what happened on 9/11. They see it, rightly so, as an attack on their country and upon themselves. And they are rightly concerned about any attempt to impose something else there that could change the narrative, that could sort of tell us what to think about it. That's what grated on the sensibilities. David, you're right. This isn't a question of right. It is a question of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But what interests me most is that there have been, great political forces seeking to exploit this. I haven't seen that much, to be honest, and the one candidate I can think of who tried to use it as a campaign issue, Rick Lazio, was demolished in a Republican primary by a candidate who was a buffoon, to be perfectly honest. So I don't really see that this issue has any resonance, and even among New York Republicans, a rare breed, it didn't. If anybody has exploited this issue, truly exploited this issue, it is those who seek to promote this myth about America as the new home of Islamophobia, that America is the Islamophobic nation. It is the country where Muslims are now in danger. That is not true. It simply is not true. That is a false narrative. What is true is that there are Muslims in this world whom many scholars use the term Islamist, which is not an epithet. It is an attempt to draw a distinction between a minority of believers in Islam who do believe, like the Taliban, like Al-Qaeda, do believe in a war on the West, have pursued it, and their supporters in the madrasas in places like Pakistan and in the mosques in Saudi Arabia that promote a form of hate. That those who seek to try to blur the distinction between these groups, this point of view, which is antithetical to America and antithetical to the values of the vast majority of America, the vast overwhelming majority of American Muslims, that those who seek to blur that distinction and to brand any critic of these extremists as somehow a bigot against all Muslims. These are the people who have exploited this issue and who have really hijacked this whole debate and turned it into something very different. That's why, David, I think that's really what is most, it's not the question of do you have a right to build in one particular place. You know, that's not really the issue. The issue is how this debate has been hijacked into one which is sort of turning the whole story around and making it as if when the sensibilities of many people are saying, why does that have to be there, of all things, that anybody who raises these questions is somehow a bigot. That's what is troubling to me, and that's what's troubling, I think, to a great many Americans, and that's what's brought up so much of this troubling debate. I don't think if we're going to have sort of a back and forth, then it should have been just the two of us. So I don't really think that's
Just the two of us.
Yeah, I mean,
if it's singing, then it's just you.
It's a charming guy. Thank you.
considering how it went last time with the SIR rebuttals, but do you have something very
Yeah,
very
I
short
just
since you were
had just a
mentioned specifically?
question. I mean, really, just a question here. Why, Jonathan, in terms of changing the narrative, it would seem to me that, particularly in light of the point that Chloe made, that in fact the erection of this cultural center and mosque near Ground Zero would, if anything, ultimately affirm the American narrative in terms of what are really the most fundamental values of freedom and equality for which this country stands. In fact, you have a group of moderate Muslims who want to participate in the civic fabric of American life, and in fact, what would be a more appropriate place, one might argue, for this to be done? In other words, I'm just not certain that I agree with you about the issue of this whole controversy being one of an attempt to change the narrative. I think, if anything, this has really been a good faith effort on the part of the Muslim community, and one has to keep in mind that this was planned, from what I understand, a number of years prior to the actual purchase of this property. Why don't you see it as affirming the American narrative? That's the part I don't
guess my
grasp.
answer to that question is, if it has to be at 9/11, then the implied question is that Americans need to be taught tolerance because of 9/11. And I don't. Well,
anywhere.
if it was going to be
cares?
anywhere, none of us would be here talking about this. Let's be
Why
honest.
Is there a Muslim-free zone? Muslims can't build here. They have to build other places. Why can't Muslims build anywhere, just like everybody else?
Well, I think
That seems
people
fair.
in general
That
should
seems
be
just.
free to build more or less wherever they want, as
Then we
long as
agree.
it's legal.
Very cool.
Okay, I want to avoid a
But
situation in which this
but
becomes
but to answer your question,
2-on-1 or 3-on-1
if we
argument.
accept that the message of 9/11 is that we have to be more tolerant, then I have a problem with that. If that's the message,
Everybody has to be more tolerant.
because America is tolerant. But if the prime lesson of 9/11 is, well, America has to be more tolerant, that's where I think many Americans say, wait a minute, that's not the message of 9/11. The message of 9/11 is that America was under attack and we have to defend ourselves, and they feel the only proper memorial there is a memorial to the victims and, frankly, a resumption of business activity in Lower Manhattan to say that you can't stop us. That seems to me the most appropriate way. Houses of worship, community centers, that's all fine. But if the message at 9/11 has to be we have to be more tolerant, then you're implying that we're not, and that's where I get off on that.
Okay, so now that we see where the sides are, let me ask the question, is it futile even to imagine addressing these topics in a way that doesn't divide us into sides, but still respects the different sorts of views involved? Chloe, you wrote that every religious group, it seems, has taken a side on this, right? This was in a piece you co-authored a little while ago.
I'll take your word for it.
Maybe one of these prolific people.
No, I mean, the piece that I co-authored with my colleague Matt Weiner was looking at the similarity in anti-Catholic rhetoric in the 19th century, just a few blocks from here, where The idea, which I looked at Ali Hershey, for example, talks about the way that, that really somehow the value of religious liberty has to be kind of put in parentheses for the clash of civilizations. And that was the way it was put also in the 19th century, but related to Roman Catholicism, so that you had people like the Samuel F.B. Morse, the inventor of the telegraph, who ran for mayor on the Know Nothing platform, saying things like, surely American Protestants, freemen, have discernment enough to discover beneath the cloven hoof of this subtle foreign heresy. They see that popery is now what it has ever been, a system of the darkest political intrigue and despotism. And the truth that popery is a political as well as a religious system, and in this respect, it differs totally from other sects and from all other forms of religion in this country, so that we can, around certain religions, somehow exclude them from the grand, fundamental value of our religious, of the Constitution protecting the free exercise of religious liberty. And I think, though, that it's a tough thing, because we've forgotten that the possibility that originally, though they haven't expressed it perhaps very well, the teaching, if there was to be any to be done in this, in the Islamic Cultural Center, may have not at all been directed at the American people. It may have been directed at Islam globally. Those very, the handful of countries where we see, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda having a predominant destructive influence, it may have been that this mosque and this American expression of Islam has something to teach the rest of the world. And it was assumed that being in America, Americans would get this. So I think that the idea that it's trying to teach Americans to be more tolerant is somehow, of course, that's an obnoxious and condescending thing. And I don't know how it got there, but I do believe the original intent had been about showing an alternative vision of Islam to the rest of the world.
How far would be far enough? If you're going to say not in my backyard, where is that line? Where do we say it would be appropriate? If it was 2 blocks further away, would that be appropriate? And the other question I would really ask when we look at this, I come from a place where I have discussions with people that I would never call bigoted, including family members, that don't think this is right, don't think it's appropriate, don't think that the mosque in Sheepshead Bay is right or appropriate. When I have a discussion with them asking, why would it be insensitive? It's only insensitive if you're assigning collective guilt to a whole population, to a whole number of individuals. They kind of step back and look at me and say, that's not true. And then when we go into it further, there is somewhat of an understanding saying, oh, well, maybe you're right, but it's still insensitive. So I think there has to be some acknowledgement here that the rhetoric that's being used is somehow informing this discussion on a national level and on a local level.
I think any time, and I'm speaking as a journalist who's covered controversies, bitter controversies about the erection of synagogues or churches in various localities, or to raise a very bitter Jewish issue, the creation of an eruv, which is a line that allows Orthodox, just basically a clothesline around an area, something that nobody can see, around an area that allows Orthodox Jews to carry things on the Sabbath. Every time those sorts of issues are created, they become very divisive, and often people who might have reasoned arguments sometimes veer off into arguments that they shouldn't be making. Certainly, if you went to some of the demonstrations about this controversy about the Ground Zero Center, some people said things that they should not have said. But that's true in virtually any American political debate. And the question of what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, this is not a question of creating Muslim-free zones. This is a question of a particular shrine, a particular point of sensitivity. And it is I have to say it's a little disingenuous on the part of some advocates for this center to keep saying, but why are you so upset about this? When it is clear to the overwhelming majority of Americans, and according to a Gallup poll that was just issued today, I might add, a plurality of Muslims think it's not appropriate, so that this is clearly an issue upon which not only people can differ, but upon which there are clear questions of attempting to impose. As I said, the reason why I keep raising this question of narratives is because people keep asking, why did it have to be there? Why is it so important? Why did you choose to have it there that in such a way that was bound to raise controversy? This is not a question of just, well, some people in some area wanted to create what anybody would want, This was a specific effort to push, as I said, to push the buttons of the American people, and that to respond with surprise when some of them say, wait a minute, what are you doing? Why are you putting me in the position of saying, that I have to either be a bigot or go along with something that clearly feels wrong to me? That to me is a very, honestly, it's kind of a dishonest position to take.
Yeah, I have to confess that this is the first time I've heard the argument that the attempt to change the narrative is to the idea that the United States is the epicenter of Islamophobia. Until this moment, I'd actually never heard that. And I am curious because, as you know, the Islamic Center was put up, there was a front page article in the New York Times in December of last year that had folks on all sides saying what a great idea it was. And it was not until May, between the subcommittee of the Community Board 1's building subcommittee and the actual Community Board 1 meeting, where possibly 3 or 4 bloggers, Pamela Gellert, the Danish gentleman, and 2 others got a hold of this information and sent it out on a listserv, to which the majority of the 9/11 family members put out that everything relating to Ground Zero, from a New York Times article to a complete craziness, gets onto. It's not disingenuous on the part of the mosque leadership to say that they were taken by surprise. I myself have heard Sharif Al-Gamal in front of 40 family members say, I built, my reason for wanting to build this center was because I was sick of seeing the over 10,000 Muslims who either work or live in Lower Manhattan praying on the street. And it was an embarrassment to me that we only have storefronts. And it was about time they tried to purchase the building, the 23rd Street Y. That was gone before they were able to do it. There's a limited number of correctly zoned buildings, and it was a few blocks from the mosque that Imam Faisal has worked at for 27 years. So I think they have said, and on a number of things have said, they were taken by surprise, and I think that is a genuine claim, not a disingenuous one.
Well, I hope that whatever your views are on this issue, this has given you an opportunity to see the breadth of thinking on it and to reflect. For myself, I'm grateful to our speakers for their presentation, and I am grateful today and for the last 3 years for this opportunity to be a part of this extraordinary community. Thank you all.